This is BBC Radio 4, 198 Longwave. In a moment, we journey back to the 1960s for the reunion. And then in 45 minutes, we head off to Lord's for Test Match Special, live coverage of the third test between England and South Africa. First, though, let's look ahead to tomorrow morning.
Edward Sturton revisits memorable broadcast debates from the archives.
The feminist movement known as women's liberation was in full flood when this week's protagonists met on BBC Two in 1974.
I don't see any way in which we can keep society as it is now and ultimately make women equal to men.
I don't think that the majority of women themselves want a very fundamental, radical change in their role.
Sally Oppenheim and Juliet Mitchell disagreed about the means to achieve sexual equality. How has the debate moved on? Head to Head continues on BBC Radio 4 tomorrow morning at 9:30.
The 1960s, a heady time of music, fashion, flower power, and sexual liberation. Sue McGregor looks back on an action-packed decade with Petula Clark, Sandie Shaw, Helen Shapiro, Jackie Trent, and Vicki Wickham, 5 of the most prominent and successful women of the decade, in the first of a new series of The Reunion.
The music business of today is dominated by what the A&R men like to call the girl acts, from headliners like Rihanna and Lady Gaga to homegrown British talent like Adele and Jessie J. They're following a long tradition of talented female performers which began with the explosion of pop in the 1960s. The numbers speak for themselves. In the 60s, Cilla Black had 17 top 40 hits, Dusty Springfield and Sandie Shaw had 15, and Petula Clark had 13, to add to the 8 she got in the late 50s. That was in the UK charts alone. These artists were popular all over the world. They chimed in nicely with the newly established teenage record-buying public. They were glamorous, wore short skirts, and weren't afraid to sing about things that would have appeared a bit racy to many of their predecessors. In essence, they sang about what it was like to be a young girl in the 60s, either in love or looking for love. It was a far cry from what made their talented predecessors so popular.
Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye. Cheerio, here I go on my way.
During World War II, our Gracie had a string of hits with songs that unashamedly appealed to patriotism. And while Gracie Fields packed them off to war, Vera Lynn gave them hope when they came back.
After the rain, the sun.
Recordings and broadcasts made them huge stars. But in 1942, sandwiched between them on a Forces request show called It's All Yours, a fresh new star was born.
Here's your niece, 10-year-old Petula Clark, one of the sweetest children you ever saw, to sing you Mighty Like a Rose.
The producer who gave the young Petula Clark that break was Stephen Williams.
This pretty little child of about 8 with lovely blonde hair, very pretty little thing in a lovely little white dress, came forward and said, "Could I please do an imitation of Nellie Wallace?"
Youth 1958 with a lingo of its own. What's it got to say for itself?
Young people were leaving buttoned-up post-war austerity behind, and teenagers became visible in a way that they simply hadn't been in the past.
Lady Lewisham, what do you think about our teenagers?
I think they're splendid. And I'm delighted you've asked me that question, because I sometimes think they get rather a raw deal.
Music journalist Eddie Fiegel.
Teen vocalists, and particularly girl groups like the Ronettes and the Shirelles, and artists like Leslie Gore, who had a huge hit with It's My Party, suddenly were singing about teenage girl emotions. Typically anything that was done in America was considered the way to go, and hugely influenced what was done in Britain.
In 1961, aged 14, Helen Shapiro burst onto the scene with the first real British girl teen hit.
Don't bother me.
I've always acted a little older than my years. I don't know why. I think most girls nowadays are the same, so it hasn't changed in any way.
In 1963, more girl singers came into their own, thanks largely to a revolutionary new programme on ITV. One of Ready Steady Go's early presenters went on to be one of Britain's best, Dusty Springfield.
Don't know what it is that makes me love you so. I only know I never wanna let you go.
The show also helped launch Cilla Black and Lulu, and making her debut in September 1964, covering an American hit, Sandie Shaw.
Oh, how can I forget you when there is always something there to remind me? Always something there to remind me.
Well, joining me are 5 women who became an integral part of the success of girl singers of the 60s. Petula Clark, child star of the 40s, whose 60s songs made her an international star. Helen Shapiro, barely in her teens and with an enormous voice, who also made it to the top of the charts. Sandie Shaw, the barefoot pop princess and a Eurovision Song Contest winner. Vicki Wickham, producer of the groundbreaking Ready Steady Go. She went on to manage Dusty Springfield. And from the island of Minorca, where she now lives, Jackie Trent, the solo artist who teamed up with Tony Hatch, wrote some of the most internationally successful songs of the decade. Petula, may I start with you? We were all singing along a bit there, and you were quite touched to hear your little self, I think.
Oh, my goodness, yes. That was a rather weedy little voice coming out there.
Well, you were only little.
Oh, well, I was very little, yes, 8 years old. Yeah.
But by the 60s, which we're talking about now, you had or were beginning to develop a parallel career in French, in France. You were living in France.
Yes, I went to France because I fell in love with a Frenchman. I mean, it's as simple and as difficult as that. And I couldn't speak a word of French, so, I mean, it was an adventure for me, and I just found myself becoming popular with the French public.
Well, sitting next to you is Helen Shapiro. And Helen, you couldn't possibly remember this, but in 1961, I was in a BBC studio in a very lowly role, clicking a stopwatch. You were on the other side of the glass, being a young star, aged 14. And as far as I remember, you were extremely self-possessed.
People have mentioned that. It's because, you know, when you're 14, you're ignorant of the pitfalls, so you're so confident, you think you can do anything, but I'm glad I gave that impression, thank you.
Sandie, you were at school still then in 61, but talent contests were how you got yourself known, was that it?
I used to sing in all the local dance halls in order to get attention and hopefully a date.
Yes, of course.
But because I was busy singing, I never actually got the date. All my friends did. So I went down the Ilford Palais, and so all my friends were saying, "Go on, get out there and sing, Sandie," because they could see all the boys standing around. So I came second, didn't come first.
Can you remember the first number you ever sang in public at a dance hall?
Everybody Loves a Lover. I sang Everybody Loves a Lover.
Doris Day.
It wasn't like that at all. We didn't sing. No, but I didn't do it in that kind of style. I'd done it sort of like R&B style.
Yeah, now, your first single, Jackie, came out in 62, but you'd done the talent show thing. There was this famous man, sort of 50s X Factor man, called Carol Levis.
Yeah,
what sort of material did you sing for him?
I think I was about 11 years of age, and I sang I Believe. And believe me, by the end of the week, everybody believed, including the whole street, because
you had a very loud voice.
Oh, God, yes. Yes, more or less, yes.
Now, Vicki Wickham, you were working for the BBC in light entertainment.
I was a PA and I learnt every song there was. We'd have the George Mitchell minstrels, we'd have actors in, and my job was to mix it all together and make the programme.
So light entertainment in those days embraced the old-fashioned, as we might call it now, popular music. But the thing about Ready, Steady, Go was this. You were listening to what might become popular.
No, exactly. I mean, we were lucky because we would go around the clubs and see people like the Stones, you know, like the Beatles, like the Animals, the Who, and we became friends. And so, of course, we'd invite our friends on.
There was a big clash between these two different ways of being, between the old school people, which my manager was, and people like Vicki, who wasn't. So I was really with Vicki. I would do whatever she wanted.
You were with Eve Taylor?
I was, and so was Jackie. I think that's the reason she threw me in the swimming pool, because she was jealous.
No, I did not throw you in the swimming pool.
Oh, yes, you did. You knew I couldn't swim.
This is a very strange story. What's all that about?
Sandie, you accused me of trying to drown you.
Yes, darling. I have witnesses.
And you should have been drowned at that particular time.
See, she's that kind of girl.
Sandie, let me put something to you.
You're just a big bully, Jackie. You're just an older woman.
No,
You older women are always bullying me.
Hold
it there.
Sandie, let me
Yes,
put
darling.
let me put to you something. There wasn't the scrutiny on young stars that there is today. If you're on the X Factor, you've got paparazzi sort of up your nose 24 hours a day.
I think there was
Is that
scrutiny. I think there was scrutiny, but today it's all fabricated. Everybody's made up and they're all stylised for this pretend scrutiny. It's not scrutiny, it's staged. In those days, you were completely open. You weren't trained to do anything. There weren't things like bodyguards. There weren't people there weren't things like safety in theatres. You were really not looked after, and it was really quite a frightening thing.
We got scrutinised,
Helen.
but we didn't have to turn up with the whole package like they do now. Couldn't do what they do now, really.
Well, you know, it was just
Petula.
different. You know, it's lots of other things have changed. So why shouldn't pop music?
Would it be true to say, Vicki Wickham, that Ready, Steady, Go was often quite chaotic?
Every week. we never got it right. We tried so hard.
I often missed my
Sandie,
cue
you did.
because I was so busy chatting backstage. And I remember once, because Gary Glitter had to get up and do me. He wasn't him then.
No, he was
somebody-
Paul Raven.
He was Paul Raven, and he was floor manager. But he had to sing my song for me because I just didn't turn up. My manager was
this his
absolutely
big break,
furious, but
perhaps?
things like that, you know, didn't bother me.
Well, it didn't really bother us, in a way.
No.
I mean, it was crazy. I mean, the show went out, we were live. It couldn't not go out.
Yeah.
Do you remember Helen Shapiro being on?
Absolutely, I remember her hair.
Big hair.
Big hair. It was great.
Yeah,
Fabulous.
well,
and the voice, of course. And we'd all
Thank
been
you.
singing Walking Back to Happiness forever, and still are.
Because the big programme before that was Thank You Lucky Stars, was the only kind of pop programme. It's where I first met Petula Clark singing Isn't This a Lovely Day to Be Caught in the Rain, Cha-Cha-Cha.
Who was singing that?
You.
Was I?
Yeah, you recorded
I
it.
don't remember that at all.
Yeah, I loved
Isn't
it.
that
It was a
terrible?
great song, and I loved the record. So
Isn't this a lovely day?
to be
Cha-cha-cha.
caught in the rain. It was great. I really loved it.
Yeah,
So
pretty
anyway,
song.
just a memory.
Well, that's sweet, Helen.
This is a question which you've probably been asked 1,000 times before, but you always, all of you give different versions or different answers. So you got to tell me now, how did the Beatles get their name?
I just thought of it.
You just thought of it. Another brilliant.
As well as flirting with the Beatles, the singers were also developing their own distinctive musical styles and exploring others. Dusty Springfield immersed herself in American soul music and R&B. Sandie Shaw followed her own path.
Now for another girl who's got a big hit behind her and is aiming for another, it's welcome to Sandie Shaw.
You have a date for a birthday tonight.
Today, fashions are changing faster than ever before. Today, more and more people are becoming fashion conscious.
By 1964, London was becoming a world centre, not just for music, but for fashion.
I think that every city has its time for about 2 years at a time, and I think about 5 years ago it was Rome, and now it's London.
It was extremely unusual for young women to leave home and live independent lives.
Music journalist Eddie Fiegel.
The norm was for young women to grow up with their families, stay there until they got married, and then move to a life with their husband, where their husband would control their finances.
For Jackie Trent, the years spent performing on the circuit bore fruit in 1965, when she finally got her number one.
Where are you now, my love? Where are you now, my love? Life was fine.
Petula Clark was also about to have her biggest hit. In 1964, she was living in Paris with her husband and manager Claude Wolff and their 2 children. Composer Tony Hatch went to see her.
Well, I went to Paris in December 1964 with 3 songs, 2 American songs, 1 British song. She turned them all down, and so I was a bit desperate, and I'd come a few hundred miles. And I said, well, look, I've got a basic idea here. It's called Downtown. And I just went da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, Downtown. And I sang the whole song without any words, but just Downtown thrown in everywhere I knew it was going to come. She said, that's the one for me. If you get a nice lyric on it, I'll do it. And look what happened.
When you're alone and life is making you lonely, you can always go downtown. When you've got worries, all the noise and the hurry seems to help, I know. downtown. Just listen to the music of the traffic in the city. Linger on the sidewalk where the neon signs are pretty. How can you lose? The lights are much brighter there. You can't forget all your troubles, forget all your cares. So go downtown. Things will be great when you're
Petula, Sandie Shaw's just said that gives her goosebumps.
In a nice way, I hope.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Everyone around the table was sort of going ooh and ah, great production, they
Yes.
say. Is that what you felt about it?
Oh, absolutely. And it wasn't, Tony wrote it, but he also orchestrated it and produced it. You know, it's the whole thing is
It's a
him.
wonderful match,
Yes.
wasn't it, of like these sparkling talents. It was just perfect. It's so iconic.
Yeah, well, we knew we had made a good record, but we didn't know we'd made a hit. And I don't know about you girls, but I don't think we ever knew when we went in to make a record that we were making a hit.
No.
You really don't know. It's the audience. No, but the audience. It's the audience who make it a hit.
Oh, how shameful.
What?
Because Jackie, this is me being ignorant, but you know, I'm so aware of the great team of Jackie Trent and Tony Hatch. But did you write the lyrics for this one?
Not for Downtown, no. No, that was Clever Clogs all on his own. No, I wish I had have done. But everything else after that, we were speaking to Burt Bacharach and Hal David, and Bacharach said, trust a Brit to come up with a saying like downtown that is used as an everyday word in America, in all cities, uptown or downtown.
But your success, Jackie, with Tony was really burgeoning now, wasn't it? I mean, there was... At first, it was a professional relationship, and then not, and then you got married.
It was a totally professional relationship. In fact, I didn't like him at all when I first met him. We got together. He came to see my act at the Astor Club in London, and he said, who wrote your opening number? And I went, I did. And he went, right.
Was it difficult being a woman in the business then? I mean, was there quite a lot of, on the part of, you know, the older producers, record producers and people in the business, a slightly patronising attitude?
Yes, I think, as Helen would say, she was 14, 15 when she was getting her hit records. And obviously with the voice of hers, that rich voice, they wouldn't know what the hell to do with you. And I think they felt the same about myself, you know. Well, what are we going to do with her? What's she going to record? You know what you want to record, but what you want to record and what you actually record are two different things entirely.
Sandie?
I think the middle generation of female pop singers in the 60s had a totally different experience. I know that everybody had stylists now. I would never have a stylist. I've always chosen my own clothes. I know exactly what I want to wear. And so I know that Dusty did exactly the same thing. Even the mistakes were our mistakes.
You bet.
And I can't imagine Dusty going in the studio and somebody telling her what to do. It was just would not happen.
And Vicki?
Dusty chose material really well. And the same with her look. I mean, it was very much from a magazine. It was very French-based. It was very glamour-based.
And very heavy eye makeup.
Very heavy eye makeup. And nobody told her and couldn't tell. I mean, she was untellable. And it's like the same with you.
I know.
And Helen, at around this time, you were on tour with the Beatles.
They were on my tour. They were one of the opening acts actually on the bill. I thought I'd just throw that in as well.
That's very impressive. So you were the number one. You were the main attraction.
Yeah, it was. I was doing a lot of. I'd left school at the end of '61, and through '62, I'd done a lot of these pop package tours where everybody goes onto the coach and goes all over. But this was their first kind of major tour, and they were lovely. And Paul was the spokesman, full of energy and everything, and. Yeah, I kind of got a bit fixated on John for quite a long while, but he did. I was 16, they were 21 and stuff like that.
Did he return the compliment at all?
He was like a big brother to me. I mean, he was actually...
Oh, that's no good.
No, well, no, but yeah, listen, who knew? And no, it was great being on tour with them, and we sang Beach Boys songs and very early Tamla stuff on
See,
the
I never
coach.
did
It was
any
great.
of that.
Oh,
No,
they
I
were
missed
great
out on
fun.
all that good stuff.
You are watching the sound of Motown. And now, the Supremes.
In 1965, an edition of Ready, Steady, Go went down in the history books. After the lifting of the Musicians' Union ban on American performers coming to Britain, British viewers had their first glimpse of some seminal groups from the US singing live.
And here with their very newest success, Nowhere to Run, it has to be Martha and Miranda. Nowhere to run to, baby. Nowhere to hide.
Catching the mood, Helen Shapiro went to the States to record an album with another legendary group. The LP called Helen in Nashville featured Elvis Presley's own backing singers, the Jordanaires. But Europe was important too.
If you were a manager and you had a successful artist, you had to think, OK, well, if I want them to have a hit in Spain, they're going to have to record the song that they've just had a huge hit with in Spanish.
Eddie Fiegel.
Consequently, it was very commonplace for British artists to record their hits in Spanish, in Italian, in French and in German.
Petula Clark recorded her own version of I Know a Place in French. Sandie Shaw did much the same thing with her French version of Message Understood. Helen's German version of Tell Me What He Said made the charts in Germany. But it was Sandie who got the ultimate prize. In 1967, she was the first British performer to win the Eurovision Song Contest.
Well, Sandie, welcome home and congratulations. How do you feel today?
I can't explain it. It was a wonderful feeling. It was very tense up to the last moment, and everybody kept saying to me all the time, you're going to win, you're going to win. And it made me feel that much worse and that much better at the same time.
What are your future plans now?
I'd like to go home and have a lovely cup of tea, an English cup of tea.
Like a puppet on a string.
Sandie, you sound quite demure then. Were you?
Probably was.
You didn't like the song very much,
That was
though.
one part of my alter ego. I have many other parts. I didn't like that song, no. It was awful. It really was. I'm over it, really. I'm over it. My grandchildren love it.
You're not over it.
I'm over it, really. And, in fact, I re-recorded it recently. And it's like a really, it's an amazing arrangement. It's really cool, and it's...
Do you do it very differently?
Absolutely differently. It's taken it down about 100 keys, and it's kind of dreamy.
Give us a little
really
flavour of
sad. It goes, oh, I wonder if one day that you'll say that you care. If you say you love me madly, I'd gladly be there.
I like it.
Like a puppet on a string.
I like that.
When you start singing it that way, the lyrics have some meaning. The song was okay. It was just a bloody arrangement.
But it's interesting that at around this time, all of you, I think, were recording your English hits in other languages.
The communications obviously weren't then as they are now, and so you had to do it, which I hated. And I hated the fact that you went to a studio and they'd already put the track down.
Oh, yeah.
And you had to just sing there, and you sounded a million... They mixed it so that the backing was a million miles away, and you were right up front, so there was no feel to it.
Yeah, German was difficult for me. I was going into a studio somewhere in Hamburg, and it was like a kind of... We were in a kind of bunker, I think, with a neon lighting, and this kind of hooter went off just before you... That meant you were about to record. Eins, zwei, drei, and off we'd go.
Vicki, it's interesting how, as pop music was becoming more international, so artists were too, and I'm thinking of Ready, Steady, Go was really groundbreaking when it brought in the black artists from America. You brought them on to Ready, Steady, Go right at the end of their tour.
We played a lot of black music on Ready, Steady, Go, which really was down to Dusty. She would go to the Brooklyn Fox and the Colony record shops in New York and bring back these piles of black R&B music. So, we would play a lot of American black music. Dusty was the one that said, they're coming over. And I went to Elkin and said, what do you think? And he was wonderful. He said, as long as Dusty will do it. And she said, yes, of course I'll do it. I mean, and we had Supremes, The Temptations, Little Stevie Wonder. The one that had a real trouble was we did a special, a whole 1 hour, with James Brown, who's absolutely incredible. But people were calling up afterwards.
They were objecting to a black
very
artist like
absolutely.
that.
Why had we given him that much time, and how dare we? And extraordinary.
What was the most fantastic thing about Ready, Steady, Go is that it had this fusion between white working class people and black American working class people, bringing their musics together. Right. And we created a hybrid which became the British pop explosion. It was out of these two things. That was your huge contribution, I think, to British music, Vicki. I think everybody should know this.
Thank you, Sandie.
Petula Clark, you experienced unease, to put it at its kindest, about appearing with a black artist in the States on an NBC television show with Harry Belafonte.
Yes, it was my first NBC special in the States. It was important for me. And they asked who I would like to have as my guest, and I said, Harry Belafonte. And he accepted, and I was delighted. And we spent 3 weeks rehearsing together, and we got on. We were really friends. And one of the songs we did together was called The Path of Glory, which I co-wrote. And we had always enjoyed singing it during rehearsal. We came to the taping, and just because I felt very emotional about it, I touched his arm. Whoa. Everything stopped. Lights went out. The sponsor went crazy. Said, "I'm not having my star touching a black man's arm." We've got to sell cars and whatever. To me, it was an absolute.
This was
storm.
1968.
Yeah, it was a storm in a teacup for me. I'd never had any sort of racist things ever. I couldn't understand it really.
But that version went out.
Yes,
and did people complain?
Yeah, of course not. No, but the fact that the sponsor had made such a fuss about it got into the press. And it just became a big story.
Jackie, at this point, you were a singer. Was it ever frustrating for you to be having hits but not necessarily performing?
I still am, darling. No, you wear two hats. You wear one as a singer-performer and then one as a songwriter. And yes, it was like writing to order. And we knew Pet's voice extremely well. She loved to put in a yeah or a whoa-whoa. So after a while, we started writing them in.
She's looking rather astonished.
Did you write them in?
Yes. Yeah, we wrote them in, darling, yes.
Okay. But you would have put them there anyway.
Well, yeah.
Whoa.
Right. I went to Nashville for 3 months to write with various writers, including Roger Cook. And Roger Cook would say, if it isn't written in 10 minutes, then it isn't worth writing. And I'd go, I beg your
I think there's some truth in that, Jackie.
It's probably true, yeah.
I'm in with the in crowd.
Television was quick to capitalise on the popularity of the girl singers. In 1966, Petula Clark got her own series. The rather highbrow critic on late-night lineup on television was unenthusiastic.
Petula Clark's on her own. She's very British. Too damn British, some people might think. And at times there's more than a passing resemblance to Mary Poppins. Not in her voice, though, not in her phrasing, which punctuates and punches a lyric into something not only ardent but intensely sexual.
The Sandie Shaw supplement television show had an altogether more sultry feel to it.
Let's take a swing at our mates across the channel, where even the kids talk funny. Hey, what is a bamba anyway? It's not in the phase book. A bamba?
In the mid-60s, there was a huge sea change in the perception of pop music.
Music journalist Eddie Fiegel.
Suddenly it gained artistic credibility, and what happened to the female vocalists was that they were very much steered into a direction that took them down a showbiz route, in leading them into TV, which was often very, very successful, but didn't, by the end of the 60s, tally with the way pop music had suddenly moved down another completely different, more artistically credible direction.
For many of the girls, the movies beckoned. It's Trad Dad was a showcase musical comedy featuring Helen Shapiro and Craig Douglas and some popular American artists.
As I was walking sometime yesterday.
And a Hollywood offer came up in 1968 for Petula Clark in the form of a starring role in Finian's Rainbow alongside Fred Astaire.
It's that old devil moon that you stole from the skies. It's that old devil moon in your eyes.
Where'd you get that Irish tutor from?
Just picked it up.
Is he the one that taught Dick Van Dyke? They got me one.
I beg your pardon.
Petula, you're being very good about being teased about your Irish accent. But I thought it wasn't bad at all, actually.
Yeah, it's better than Tommy Steele's.
Yeah, or Fred Astaire's even.
Oh, yes.
But that was a great opportunity for you.
Yes, it was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. There's a lot of flower power going on.
And smoking certain substances.
Well, yes, all that stuff. But it was
Not
with
our pet.
Please. And Fred Astaire, hello.
Not our Fred.
Yeah, not our Fred. And it was great. It was multiracial. You know, there were lots of good things going on there. It was a wonderful experience. It was California in the late 60s, which was kind of great.
But Helen, you were in It's Trad Dad?
I don't think it sort of was the most overwhelmingly successful film that ever came out. But the guy who directed it, Dick Lester, went on to become Richard Lester, who did the Beatles films, etc., etc.
Sandie, moving into the 70s now, you had a really rough time when your husband, Jeff Banks, the designer, went bankrupt, and you found yourself responsible for his enormous debts.
That's true. I wasn't expecting it to get heavy like this, but
You don't want to talk about it, Sandie?
No, it's kind of. I feel kind of. I think it's part of my story. Yeah, I think it's a really important part of my story. It was incredibly difficult for me because I couldn't apply anything that my parents had taught me to the situation I was in, and I was very, very alone. I was so alone and so isolated, and it was very, very, very dark.
And that led you to having to work like a maniac to make it up again, which you did.
Yes, and it made me hate singing.
Oh.
It made me, because when you sing for the money, it's this awful, awful experience. I like to give it. You know, I don't like to...
Well, it has to be a joy of some kind, I think.
Absolutely.
It has to, for me anyway.
Yeah.
But it's not all it's not all sort of wine and roses sometimes in your business.
It certainly isn't. And for girls, it is incredibly difficult to choose the partner. It's taken me 3 goes. I finally got it right.
Good.
But it was difficult.
I went through a similar style of thing in the 70s as well, and I've tried the marriage thing 3 times and finally got it right as well. But yeah, somewhere in there was a fashion business that we had, my husband at the time and me, and it went down the tubes in the 3-day week in the early 70s. So, and then it was singing and going around doing the clubs. But those were the times when personally I learned how to get out there on a stage and sing and do it properly.
You get to the point, especially when you've got young children, you thought, oh my God, you know, do I really need to do this? And the answer was, well, yes, I didn't need to, but I enjoyed it. So I think we all go through the various dramas in a life. I too are on my 3rd marriage and very, very happy with it too. I mean, it's like... It was a hell of a shock when Tony and I split up. It came completely out of the blue and on my birthday. And that was it. So these things do... And it took me 10 years to try and clear that out of my system. But it was very, very difficult. Then I met my husband at Luton Airport.
As one does.
Oh, why not?
It is like the advert.
Were
Where
you
do you
truly
come, my
wafted
darling?
here from paradise?
Vicki, you must have observed a lot of artists going through really rotten times and acted as mum or auntie or sister or whatever.
I still do. But I'm really lucky as the only gay amongst you here. I found somebody in 1970 and have been with her ever since. So I'm extraordinarily lucky and wouldn't swap it for the world.
By the end of the 1960s, a new generation of singers had appeared, and many wrote their own material. Performers like Joni Mitchell took the focus off some of the original girl singers.
Woke up, it was a Chelsea morning, and the first thing that I heard was a song outside my window.
Meanwhile, Petula Clark in this 1968 interview already seemed to be falling out of love with the music industry.
When I eventually got into a recording studio, and all these hairy musicians were playing this hairy music, and I would stand there and feel like Mrs. Chips, a headmaster's wife, and not feel anything happening to me. You know, it was very, I felt like another person.
As for Vicki Wickham, one important period of her life was coming to an end. Ready, Steady, Go broadcast its last episode in December 1966. Things were changing for Sandie Shaw as well, even if she gives the impression in this 1968 interview that it was business as usual.
What are your future plans now about with your singing career?
Well, I go to Iran soon to do some shows for the Shah in his palace.
For the Shah?
For the Shah, he asked me to go over and do a couple of shows for him.
A couple of shows for the Shah?
I was
Lovely.
recommended by the Alga Cab.
Stop, and you will become aware.
For Helen Shapiro, there were still a few hits to come. In '67, notably, the Northern Soul classic Stop and You'll Become Aware. As time went on, she concentrated more on jazz, even taking regular residencies at Ronnie Scott's. For Vicki Wickham, the 70s saw a move into artist management. She had huge success with the American girl group La Belle and Lady Marmalade. Sandie Shaw emerged from her difficult and debt-ridden 70s with an unlikely hit in the 1980s with Morrissey of the Smiths.
I just had a chance to meet her through people at the record company. And
He's a fibber. He used to write me fan letters.
Well, yes.
Did you really? Did you really?
No,
Yes, short ones, very short ones.
the first one was quite long.
I know, but the
I
second one
remember
was
it.
really short.
I thought, what a weirdo.
Jackie Trent, with her husband Tony Hatch, moved to Australia. In the 80s, they wrote a song which has had probably more television exposure than anything else they wrote together.
Neighbours, everybody needs good neighbours.
And in '87, Vicki Wickham, now the manager of Dusty Springfield, achieved what was to become Dusty's final triumph with the Pet Shop Boys. Dusty Springfield, What Have I Done to Deserve This, with the Pet Shop Boys. Looking back now on to the 60s, how do you feel about them? Did they make you rich? Did they make you happy?
They were very eventful for me, the 60s, and they provided me with everything that I needed to experience for the next phase of my life. After being with the Smiths, which was a fantastic experience, I loved every single minute of it. I went back to university, I went to university, and I started to be a psychotherapist. I am now, I've been a fully trained psychotherapist in practice for, over 15 years now. And I deal totally just with people in the creative industries. My husband, who's also a shrink, we often spend Saturday night watching our patients, seeing how well they're doing on telly or...
Helen.
Towards the end of the 70s, I was invited to appear in some theatre. I did some theatre. I did Nancy and Oliver for a year in the West End, which was wonderful, and some other things like that.
Yeah, that was brilliant.
And thank you. And then I did this album called Straighten Up and Fly Right, which was a jazzy thing, which was picked up by Humphrey Lyttelton. And because of that, we went on to do a lot of concerts together for 17 years. And then in 1987, I became a believer in Jesus. And it's changed my life completely. I came out of the business actually 9 years ago. It was great, and it was like, thank you. Now I want to go full-time doing my gospel evenings, which is what I do, in which I sing some spiritual songs, but I talk mostly. And I live for it and love it, and that's where I'm at now.
Jackie?
You know, I'm not into nostalgia, but when you look back on it, they were very, very special days. It was a magical time. Absolute magic. That's all I can say. Some of it was hard. Some of it was an absolute joy.
wouldn't change it at all. We were really quite naive, and it's always been a learning curve, let's just put it that way. So is life, you know. And if I gave everything up tomorrow, I wouldn't have one regret whatsoever. I really wouldn't.
But Jackie, it was ages ago, and it's history, and it's just made the foundation for me for these amazing women that we have today.
Yes, absolutely.
I started this group up. It's called the Lady Cluster, and it's young women now that are in the music industry. There's like a core group of like myself and Rumer and Joss Stone and Duffy, and we invite other people in to come in, and at the moment it's a really new group, and we just sit and we just share, and the amount of respect that they show for people from our generation, they realise that we actually made music up.
And it hasn't been protected, has it? I mean, you know, when we see what's happening now with all the downloading and stuff, I mean, it really is, okay, it's a lot of fun for a lot of people, but it really has damaged the business quite a bit.
Well, it's damaged the artists more than anything else, because it's downgraded what we do.
Yeah.
It was bad enough when they called it product, and now they call us content.
And Petula, you have really never stopped.
Well, yes, there's an album out in France. And now I'm in London doing a new album in English, and I'm really quite excited about that.
That's
great. Having a great time here doing that. I mean, listening to Helen, I mean, that's quite an interesting thing that you're doing, to just walk away from the business and do something else that you really believe in. That's great. I happen to like what I do. I think I'm very lucky, privileged to be able to do it still.
And Vicki?
I do a lot of radio programmes for back in radio, BBC 2, Radio 2, and unbelievably, having sat through endless workshops of theatre programmes that the people wanted to put on Dusty, and hated them all, and just thought that she looked like a miserable person, which she wasn't. A friend of mine, Tris Penner, and myself have just started writing a musical which we're really pleased with, because it's personal, it's honest, it's Dusty. I mean, it's the silly Dusty and the great Dusty. So that's what I'm up to.
And if you had to choose a Dusty song...
From the 60s, there's a song called Going Back, which is just beautiful.
Great record.
Don't play it, because I'll cry.
Good.
Yeah.
Vicki Wickham, Jackie Trent, Petula Clark, Sandie Shaw and Helen Shapiro.
I know my place.
Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, girls.
I think I'm going back to the things I learned so well in my youth. I think I'm returning to those days when I was young enough to know the truth. Now there are no games to only pass the time. No more coloring books, no Christmas bells to chime.
Going Back, sung by Dusty Springfield, ending that edition of The Reunion. It was produced by Brian McCluskey and David Prest, and was a whistle-down production for BBC Radio 4. In next week's program, Sue McGregor will be hearing about the various experiences of some of the Asians who were